I hid my success company's secret from my family for years. Their faces paled when they saw my true value, not because I needed them to see it, but because they never imagined I existed beyond their shadow. That night began like so many others, with me slipping into a seat at the edge of a table I didn't really belong to. My name is Miranda Kerr. I'm 34 years old. I live in a converted design studio in Brooklyn, New York. Though no one in my family ever asked for my address, I co-founded and now quietly lead Neura, a behavioral AI platform that trains corporate and healthcare teams using emotion-based learning. The company was valued at $4.2 billion last quarter, though I doubt my mother could name it even if she saw it in Forbes. To them, I'm still the artsy one. The girl who quit law school after 6 weeks and never quite returned from New York. My family lives in Boston, in a red brick Victorian 2 blocks from the state courthouse. My father, Daniel Kerr, is a retired federal judge, sharp and terrifying even in his silence. My mother, Helena, lectures at Harvard Law and collects accolades like someone else might collect wine. And my sister, Vanessa, is a physician at Mass General who's been called the face of surgical empathy in 6 magazines. That evening, we were gathered for my father's 50 Years of Justice Gala, held at the historic Tremont Hall, complete with crystal chandeliers, linen tuxedos, and the kind of slow, rigid elegance that makes you sit straighter, even if no one's looking. I had flown in that morning, stayed quietly at a boutique hotel near Beacon Hill, and arrived 15 minutes early, only to be seated at the end of the table next to Aunt Carol and her husband, who couldn't remember whether I still did something with websites. I smiled politely, adjusted the hem of my black dress, and kept my posture calm. Vanessa arrived like she always does, radiant and loud enough to turn heads, draped in a navy satin gown, and introduced 5 times before dessert. When my father rose to speak, the lights softened and silence fell like something rehearsed. He lifted his glass and gave the kind of speech you only give if you truly believe your life is a blueprint. He thanked colleagues, recalled federal cases with flair, and when he spoke of family, I saw it coming before the words left his mouth. I am proud to share this evening with my brilliant wife, Helena, who made me believe discipline could be a form of love, and with my daughter Vanessa, who carries the Kerr legacy into medicine with compassion and excellence. He turned slightly toward me then, his tone shifting just enough to chill the air. And Miranda, who continues to explore creative ventures in New York. We wish her the best. It was not cruelty, not exactly. It was the same subtle dismissal I'd known since I was 18 and decided I didn't want to clerk for a Supreme Court justice. The same tone that once asked me at Thanksgiving, "Are you still playing around with that tech project?" It stung, but I didn't flinch. I took a sip of water and turned my attention to the floral centerpiece like it held secrets I hadn't yet earned. After the applause and photographs, I slipped away upstairs. I had reserved a private lounge on the top floor under a business name no one in my family would recognize. Inside, Rachel had already arranged the set of signed reports, printouts, and a small projector for later. I stood by the window for a moment, watching Beacon Hill light up like a jewelry box under the night sky. My heart wasn't racing. It was steady, calm, the kind of calm you only earn after you've been underestimated for long enough that it no longer surprises you. The truth is, I hadn't come to prove anything, not anymore. I came to say it out loud for me. My phone buzzed. "Vanessa, Dad's ready to head out. Are you still here?" I replied. "Yes. Come upstairs. Suite 7A. Bring everyone. I have something to share." Their footsteps echoed before the knock came. I opened the door, let them enter without ceremony, and gestured toward the seats. My father looked confused. My mother narrowed her eyes slightly, as if reading cross-examination cues. Vanessa smiled the way surgeons do before a difficult cut. I waited until everyone sat, then reached for the folder on the coffee table. It was labeled Legacy. My voice was clear when I said, "Before you leave tonight, I want to show you what I've been building. You always said I was wasting time, but let's see what time built." Vanessa was the first to speak. "Of course." She glanced at the folder labeled Legacy with a small, puzzled smile, like I had brought a scrapbook of summer sketches. "Miranda, is this about your creative platform again? Dad's really tired. Maybe another time." My father didn't bother to look at me. He reached for the scotch that Rachel had arranged on a side tray, his movement sharp, efficient, dismissive. I could see the edge of boredom already setting in on his face, that slight twitch of the eye he used in court when a witness had nothing useful to offer. My mother, ever the diplomat, rested her fingers lightly on her lap and said, "Sweetheart, if this is about your startup, we're happy for you, truly, but your father's night has been quite full." That was the language they always used, soft, polished, and perfectly empty. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't argue. I simply opened the folder and turned it toward them. The first document was a financial report. Current valuation, $4.2 billion. Series E funding completed. Projected IPO date, pending. My mother's expression didn't change immediately, but her fingers tightened around the glass in her hand. Vanessa leaned in slightly, her smile now frozen, confused. My father still didn't react. I placed the next page on top of the first. It was a published article from Harvard Business Review. Neura, the AI platform changing how Fortune 500 companies train people to think. I watched the lines around my father's mouth shift. I waited. They always told me I was impatient, that I expected applause without merit, but I had learned patience in silence, in being underestimated, in building something no one believed I could build. "I'm not here to ask for anything," I said finally, "not approval, not investment, not even a conversation, really. But I think it's important you know that the company you've dismissed for a decade is currently restructuring 3 federal agency learning systems." Vanessa opened her mouth to interrupt, but I continued before she could pivot the moment. "We've partnered with the Department of Education on trauma-informed teacher training. Our predictive empathy model was adopted by 6 medical school networks, including the one you work for." Her eyes narrowed. "That's not possible. Our board rejected the Neura pitch last year." I held her gaze. "They did. After you privately advised them not to move forward. You said it lacked medical rigor and emotional integrity. Those were your exact words." For the first time that evening, silence took hold for real. Not the polite silence of formality, but the breath-held pause when something has just broken and no one wants to be the first to touch the pieces. My father set his glass down. "Slower this time. You're saying you've built a platform that's being used by the government?" he asked. His voice low, skeptical, still tethered to disbelief. "Yes," I said, "and by Amazon, Google, and Stanford's Behavioral Institute. And our platform currently supports over 1.7 million users globally." My mother gave a light laugh, the kind people give when they think they've misunderstood. Miranda, why haven't we heard of this? Why wouldn't you tell us? I didn't answer right away. I let the question hang because the answer was so old. I wasn't sure if saying it out loud would sound bitter or pathetic. So I walked to the sideboard, picked up the tablet Rachel had prepared, and cast the current user analytics to the room's display. The dashboard loaded slowly, a deliberate delay that made the tension inside the room pulse like a metronome. When the data finally filled the screen, no one spoke. At the top, under the bold logo of Neura, sat the numbers they couldn't deny. In that moment, I realized I wasn't trying to impress them. I was just tired of pretending I had nothing to show. My father stood, walked toward the screen, read slowly, as if translating a language he had dismissed for years. Neural behavioral tracking, real-time empathy index, workforce recalibration. He turned to me then, not with pride, not even with anger, with something else, something unsettled. When did this happen, he asked. I took a deep breath. It started 5 years ago, with one failed prototype, one co-founder, 2 credit cards, and 0 interest from anyone in this room. My mother shook her head lightly. We just didn't understand your world. Miranda, you never explained it to us. I laughed, soft and unforced. I tried, for years. But you were too busy being disappointed to listen. Vanessa exhaled slowly and picked up one of the reports. This is impressive, she admitted, though the words dragged on her tongue like they resisted leaving. I didn't know it was you. I nodded. That was the point. I watched them all sit back down, recalibrating their sense of me. I could almost hear the machinery turning in their minds, rewriting past conversations, adjusting their perception to make room for this new version of someone they thought they knew. For a second, it felt like vindication. Then it just felt hollow. Because if it took $1 billion valuation for them to finally see me, then maybe they never really did. Vanessa stayed quiet for longer than I expected, her fingers resting on the edge of the tablet screen as if afraid the data might disappear. My mother had moved to the window, her reflection caught in the glass, perfectly composed and still. My father returned to his seat, slower this time, and folded his hands in front of him the way he did in court when preparing to speak. But I spoke first, not to win, not to shame them, just to say what had never been said. Do you remember the summer I interned with the app design firm, I asked? The one in Chelsea. You said it was a phase. My mother turned slightly, not answering. That's where I met Grace. She's the co-founder of Neura. She had just been fired from a university research lab for pushing experimental models in learning diagnostics. I was building wireframes for medical interns who failed traditional tests but scored high on adaptive reasoning. You didn't ask then, but that was the beginning. I walked to the table and picked up the printed press kit. It had photos of our early team, investor letters, and the original white paper proposal. I set it in front of them without drama. We pitched this concept to 5 angel investors. 4 laughed. 1 said it was brilliant, but not fundable. I sent a blind email to a Stanford researcher who happened to open it during a flight delay. That email changed everything. My father exhaled through his nose, a habit he developed when suppressing disagreement. Miranda, I understand your frustration, but surely you can see why we didn't expect all this. We assumed you were struggling. You were quiet, distant. I nodded. Yes, I learned to be quiet. You rewarded quiet. You labeled my work as eccentric and unproductive every time I tried to explain. So I stopped explaining. Vanessa leaned back slightly, her voice cautious now. You could have said something. You could have called when things started working. I looked at her, not with anger, but with clarity. When you called the hospital board and told them I lacked clinical integrity, did you imagine I'd want to share anything with you again? Her face tightened. I didn't know it was your platform. You presented under a company code name. I smiled faintly. You didn't know because you didn't ask. You assumed no version of success could exist that didn't mirror your own. My mother finally spoke, her voice almost too even. We only wanted you to have a secure life, Miranda, structure, reputation, a name that holds weight in real rooms. I looked at her, then at the others. You wanted a daughter you could explain to your colleagues. You didn't want questions. You wanted boxes. I didn't fit, so you chose not to see me at all. For a moment, no one responded. Then Uncle Gerald, who had arrived late and was sitting quietly behind them, spoke in his usual smooth tone. If the platform really works, as you say, maybe there's room for collaboration. Our firm has been testing internal training upgrades. Perhaps Nura could... I cut in before he finished, my tone steady. We're not accepting new family-related contracts. We've already rejected offers from your legal network through third-party audits. You just didn't know it came from me. He blinked, visibly embarrassed. You've been watching our firm. I shook my head, not watching, monitoring. Our system flags institutions with outdated learning practices. Yours topped the list last quarter. We sent recommendations anonymously. They were ignored. Vanessa's posture shifted, and I knew that twist of discomfort well. It was the look of someone suddenly unsure of their place in the story. I continued, not out of cruelty, but completion. You taught me to think critically, to build strong foundations, to never speak unless I had facts to back me. I used every lesson you gave me. I just didn't use them the way you wanted. My father leaned forward, eyes narrowed. You could have changed the conversation. You could have brought us in sooner. What exactly do you want now? Miranda. I paused, felt my breath rise and settle. I want you to sit with the reality that what you dismissed wasn't failure. It was incubation. I built something in silence, and it grew, not because of your approval, but in spite of it. Their silence this time wasn't shocked. It was reflective. I could feel it in the way my mother turned away from the window and looked directly at me for the first time all night. Vanessa was no longer holding her smile. My father didn't speak again. Not immediately. He just sat there, facing a version of me they had never bothered to ask about. It wasn't victory. It was exposure, not of them, but of me, of everything I had built to prove nothing, and in doing so, proved everything. I remembered sitting in my apartment 5 years earlier, with nothing but a folding table, a whiteboard too small for our ideas, and 2 laptops that overheated after 3 hours of machine learning simulations. Grace had been pacing, reading lines of failed code aloud, while I rewrote a predictive empathy formula that would later anchor our entire system. We couldn't afford ergonomic chairs or brand consultants, but we knew we were building something real. What we lacked in polish, we made up for in clarity. Every investor we pitched saw the same thing 2 women without institutional backing, asking for time and faith in something invisible. Most passed, the ones who didn't. They're on their 5th round of profit sharing now, back in the suite. My father was still struggling to reassemble the hierarchy in his mind. I could see it on his face. He wasn't angry anymore. He was uncertain. And uncertainty was a language he never allowed in his courtroom or his home. "I want to understand one thing," he said finally, his voice lower, more human than it had been all evening. "If your company is as successful as you say, why hide it from us for this long?" I didn't answer right away. I let the question breathe, because it wasn't really a question. It was a reckoning. "You always taught me to present things only when they're defensible," I said quietly. "You told me that half-finished arguments were weak, that ideas had to stand on data, not feeling. So I waited. I waited until I could put proof in your hands that didn't require your imagination." My mother stepped in gently, her voice calm and rehearsed. "You know we were just trying to protect you. This world is harsh. We didn't want you to get hurt chasing something unstable." I looked at her, no longer with resentment, but with distance. "You didn't protect me. You protected yourselves from being embarrassed by me. There's a difference." Vanessa stood and walked toward the drinks cart, not to serve anyone, but to collect herself. She poured a half-inch of wine into a glass and stared at it like it held more answers than anything I'd said. "I remember when the Neurodeck came across my desk," she said finally, her voice tight. "I thought it was smart. Too smart for a startup that didn't list its founder. I dug deeper, couldn't find your name, figured it was another anonymous research team trying to push through untested tech. I didn't know it was you." Her tone softened, but it wasn't regret. It was hesitation dressed as apology. "You didn't want to know," I said, not cruelly but plainly. "You wanted to be sure I stayed in your shadow, and when I started stepping outside it, you made sure I didn't have access to your networks. That's fine. I made my own." My father flinched at the word, not from shame, but from recognition. He knew I wasn't bluffing, and that truth unsettled him more than anything else tonight, because for the first time, he wasn't the smartest person in the room. "Let's say I accept all this," he said, leaning back slightly. "Let's say I believe you've built something monumental." What now? I looked at him, not with anger, not even with a desire to impress him, just a sense of completion. "Nothing. There is no now for you and my company. You're not a part of this story. That's the point. I built it because you wouldn't help me. I succeeded because you didn't believe in me." He clenched his jaw slightly, but stayed quiet. My mother looked at me with that familiar expression of confusion wrapped in admiration, a face she reserved for moments when I did something that didn't fit her expectations, but was too significant to dismiss. Vanessa set down her glass and returned to her seat. "What are you going to do next?" she asked. It was the first real question she had asked me in a decade. "Tomorrow morning," I said. "I meet with the Department of Defense to finalize a resilience framework for returning veterans. After that, I fly to London to oversee the pilot of NURA's new cognitive bias module for judicial training. And when that's done, I'll return to Brooklyn, where my team is, where the work is, where I belong." No one spoke, not because they didn't have something to say, but because they finally understood that I wasn't performing for them. I had once dreamed of this moment, imagined their stunned silence, fantasized about the apology, the admiration, the quiet awe. But as I stood there, I realized I didn't need it anymore. What they thought I lacked was never a lack. It was just a different path, one they never had the imagination to follow. And that was no longer my burden to carry. The folder lay closed on the table now, but its weight hadn't disappeared. It hovered in the room like a quiet truth no one could push away. The thing about building something real in silence is that when you finally speak, you don't need volume, you only need precision. And that night, every line I spoke landed exactly where it was supposed to. They had expected an artist, a dropout, a disappointment who'd appear briefly, say something awkward, and disappear quietly. Instead, I had rewritten the entire narrative while they were too busy writing me off. Vanessa stared at her hands for a long time. She used to have this certainty in every room, the kind that comes from being favored for so long that doubt becomes irrelevant. But now she was quiet, unsure, visibly recalculating everything she thought she understood about success. "I didn't mean to block your work," she said finally, her voice low but not defensive. "I genuinely didn't know it was you. I thought it was some out-of-touch startup peddling incomplete research. I didn't know it was real." I gave a small nod, not to forgive her, but to acknowledge that, for the first time, she was speaking without performance. My father stayed seated, fingers interlocked, the way he used to hold his hands during tense depositions, but his eyes were no longer sharp. They had softened, like someone looking at a photograph they didn't remember taking. "Do you ever wonder what this would have looked like if we had supported you earlier?" he asked. "Not anymore," I said. I used to lie awake and imagine what it would have meant if you had answered my calls, if you had told your colleagues to listen instead of laugh. But I stopped needing that when I realized my value didn't depend on your understanding. It wasn't an attack. It was a release. And in that release, there was power. My mother finally walked back to the table and sat beside Vanessa, carefully crossing her legs and smoothing her dress. Her voice was softer than I expected. "There's a donor dinner at the university next month," she said slowly. "They're honoring women in innovation. They reached out about Neura. I told them we weren't connected to the founder. I didn't realize it was you." I tilted my head slightly. "That's the part I never understood. You didn't know it was me, and yet you still told them we weren't connected, as if distancing yourselves from something unknown was safer than being curious." She blinked, and for a moment, I thought she might say something heartfelt, but the moment passed. "You've always done things your own way," she said instead, as if that explained everything. "Yes," I replied, "and my way worked, not because it was perfect, but because I was willing to fail in front of no one until it worked." Uncle Gerald, who had been silent too long, leaned forward again. "Miranda, with a valuation that size, there will be acquisition offers, mergers, governance demands. You'll need legal structuring, strategy, protection. We should talk soon." I smiled lightly, the kind of smile that doesn't reach your eyes. "We already have legal teams. Gerald, Global Counsel. We have infrastructure in Zurich and data ethics advisory out of Helsinki. Thank you for the offer, but we're more than covered." That was the moment they understood I hadn't just succeeded. I had scaled beyond them, beyond their advice, beyond their reach. They were no longer the mentors I once needed. They were spectators at a show that had already sold out. The room fell quiet again, and this time the silence felt final. Rachel knocked gently on the door, then entered with a clipboard. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but the Neura East leadership team is requesting your final signature before we push the onboarding live tomorrow." I nodded, took the clipboard, and signed my name with the ease of someone who'd earned the right to write it. As Rachel left, my mother reached across the table and touched my hand lightly. It was not affection, it was habit. "Miranda," she said, "what do you want from us now?" It was a question I'd once begged to be asked, and now that it had arrived, it felt unnecessary. Nothing. I said plainly, "That's the point. I used to want validation. Then I wanted silence. Now I just want to keep building. And maybe someday someone else like me won't have to hide while doing it." Her hand withdrew slowly. My father looked at me, and for the first time, said nothing at all. The moment they stopped trying to argue was the moment I realized everything had already shifted, not just the tone of the room, but the very balance of power between us. I had walked into that suite as their overlooked daughter, the misunderstood one with vague creative projects and no track record they respected. And now, in the quiet that followed my answer, it was clear none of them would ever see me that way again. There was no confrontation left, just clarity. And that kind of clarity doesn't need to scream to be permanent. I stood up slowly, not in defiance, but in closure. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt like something old had finished writing itself. "I have a flight at 6 a.m., I said. Gathering my coat, we're finalizing the neural feedback layer in real-time communication. It's already been piloted in emergency training simulations. We're scaling it to civilian conflict resolution next quarter." Vanessa looked up at me, and for once, there was no defense in her posture, just recognition. Not agreement, not guilt, just the honest weight of what she now knew to be true. "I didn't realize you were doing all of this," she said. "I know," I replied. "You weren't supposed to. That's what made it real." I glanced toward my father. He hadn't moved. His expression hadn't changed. But I saw it. The silence in his jawline. The way he was still trying to find the right frame to place me in. I had existed outside of his model of success for too long, and now I had outgrown it completely. "You built a machine to teach empathy," he said finally. "Do you think you could have built it if we had given you more?" I paused. Maybe. But it wouldn't have been the same machine. This one understands what it's like to be ignored, interrupted, dismissed. It was designed by someone who had to learn empathy by surviving a lack of it. The air in the suite had changed, lighter in some places, heavier in others. It felt like the echo left behind after a courtroom verdict. Not dramatic, but final. I opened the door, and Rachel stood just outside, already holding my travel binder and overnight bag. She didn't ask how it went. She didn't need to. She glanced at the room behind me, and then back to my face. "Everything you needed to say?" she asked. I gave a small nod. Everything I needed to stop needing. As we walked down the hallway, I didn't look back, not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood that there's a difference between winning a conversation and reclaiming your identity. One ends with applause, the other ends in peace, at the elevator. I glanced down at my phone. I had 3 missed calls from the Department of State and a meeting confirmation for the Ethics Roundtable I'd been waiting months to secure. It reminded me that my real life was never in that suite. It was outside of it. It always had been. The car pulled up to the side entrance of the hotel, not the main drop-off where guests posed for photos, but the side path used by staff and suppliers. I preferred it. It was quieter, less performative. I slid into the back seat as Rachel handed my bag to the driver. She didn't say much, only handed me an envelope. "This came through your private box," she said. "From the Office of Technological Equity." I opened it, scanning the letter briefly. A federal invitation to contribute to a cross-sector advisory board on human-AI collaboration standards. My name wasn't buried. It was bold. First line, lead seat, no footnotes, no secondary credit, no qualifiers. I looked out the window as the car pulled onto the expressway. Boston's skyline faded into the rear view, and I let it. I didn't need to conquer it. I had already outgrown it. There was no speech that would have fixed our family, no signature moment that would have made everything right. What I got instead was something harder earned. Self-authorship, legacy built not through inheritance, but through persistence. And the one thing they never taught me, the one thing they had no language for, was how to lead quietly while being doubted. Back in New York, the air felt cleaner, the cold sharper. I walked into our studio, still dim at midnight, but alive with the sound of quiet systems updating in the background. Grace had left a note on the conference table beside an open laptop. "Welcome home. The London deck's finalized." I left the Rothko light on. I smiled. I hadn't told her about the sweet conversation. But I would, eventually, when it no longer mattered, tonight. I just wanted to sit in the stillness of a place that never asked me to prove anything. The next morning, I arrived at the studio earlier than usual. The floors still carried the scent of linseed and sawdust. A quiet detail that reminded me how far Nura had grown from its first iteration, when we were just a whiteboard sketch in a sublet corner office with no lock on the door. Grace was already there, sleeves rolled up, hair pinned back, eyes moving across 3 dashboards at once. She didn't greet me with ceremony. She simply asked, "How'd Boston go?" I poured a coffee, leaned against the counter, and let the silence answer her. She didn't push. She never did. Grace knew the weight of rooms where people listen just enough to interrupt, and she knew what it meant for me to walk out of one and feel lighter instead of smaller. By noon, we were in the Rothko room, briefing a London partner on our next phase integration model. Nura was moving faster than even we anticipated. Companies once skeptical were now quietly piloting our bias interruption tools in leadership programs. Medical universities had begun redesigning ethics curricula around our patient response simulations. There was no grand PR machine. We had built our growth the same way we built our code, layered, resilient, intentional. We didn't need applause. We needed impact, and we had it. Around 2:00, Rachel returned from a courier pickup, holding an envelope with the Harvard crest stamped across the seal. She set it down without comment, but I already knew what it was. An invitation to speak, keynote slot, spring conference on future ethics and technology. They had listed my full name. No error, no initial. For a long moment, I just stared at the envelope, not because it shocked me. It didn't. What struck me was how different this version of recognition felt. I wasn't being invited to justify my place. I was being asked to lead the conversation. That distinction changes everything. I didn't respond to the invitation right away. I left it unopened on my desk while we moved through the rest of our agenda. I had grown careful with attention. Not every platform deserved access to the core of what we built. Later that evening, as the team trickled out, Grace sat beside me on the studio couch, reading through notes from a pilot site in Sao Paulo. They want to scale before the end of the year. She said, "The local health systems are demanding it now." I nodded, scanning the report, noting the metrics. "We'll need 2 more engineers to support the expansion," I said. She looked up and smiled faintly. "Remember when it was just us trying to figure out what empathy looks like in a string of data?" I nodded again. "And we almost gave up when our first model collapsed under live user unpredictability." We both went quiet for a while. Outside the gallery windows, Brooklyn shimmered in the muted orange haze of early spring dusk. Somewhere in the distance, someone was playing Miles Davis, and the sound curled faintly through the brick alley. It reminded me of that first winter in New York, when my parents stopped returning my calls and Vanessa told me to just take the LSAT and get it over with. That was the year I stopped explaining my dreams and started protecting them. And in protecting them, I learned how to build them alone. Grace broke the silence. Are you going to respond to Harvard? I took a sip of coffee and said, eventually, but they're not the priority, not anymore. She didn't ask what was. She already knew. The work itself had become its own reward. We weren't just building a company. We were rewriting how trust, emotion, and human judgment intersected with machines. We were teaching systems to listen the way people often forget to. And for the first time in my life, I was surrounded by a team that didn't need to be convinced I belonged in the room. The screen across the gallery lit up with a security feed notification. A figure at the front entrance, standing with poise but not quite certainty. Vanessa, still in professional attire, though her coat was draped more loosely than usual, and her bag sagged slightly at the shoulder. She stood without knocking. I watched her hesitation from my tablet before I said a word. Grace looked at me. You want me to tell her you're not here? I shook my head. Tell her I have 10 minutes. Bring her to the listening lab. Grace nodded and left. I stood and moved slowly toward the small soundproof room that once served as our prototype studio. It had no plaques, no windows, just good acoustics and a table designed for people to listen before responding. It was the only room in the entire building where I had never once been interrupted. Vanessa stepped into the room carefully, as if unsure whether she was entering as my sister or as someone requesting a meeting. I didn't offer small talk. I simply gestured to the chair opposite mine and sat down, placing a glass of water near the edge of the table. She glanced around, eyes settling on the textured acoustic panels, the 2 slim microphones embedded in the table, the soft lighting built to mimic early morning. She understood almost immediately that this room wasn't designed for debate. It was designed for clarity. I didn't expect you to agree to see me, she said, adjusting her sleeves out of habit. I nodded. I didn't agree to see you. I agreed to listen for 10 minutes. She accepted that without protest, which already told me she had arrived differently than before, not to convince, but to understand for a moment. She didn't speak. She looked at the wall behind me, then back at me, then finally said, I read the white paper, the latest one, about adaptive cognition. It's not just impressive, it's something we should have been using years ago. I let the compliment sit there without responding to it. When you've spent years being minimized, praise rarely feels like progress. It feels like delay. I wanted to say that I was wrong, she added. Not just about the product, about you. I thought your silence meant you were failing. I thought your distance was resentment. But now I think you just stopped trying to explain yourself to people who had already decided they knew everything. That was closer to the truth than I expected her to get. And still, I didn't rush to make her feel better. She leaned forward slightly. When I blocked the neuropilot, I honestly thought I was protecting patients. I didn't trust what I didn't understand, and I didn't ask because I didn't think it could be you. I watched her carefully, not for weakness, but for sincerity. I had learned the difference. You don't have to fix it. I said plainly, there's nothing to fix. That hospital is already licensed with one of our competitors now. They're 3 versions behind. That decision cost them, not me. Vanessa winced slightly but nodded. I know. Their diagnostics are already showing lags in training efficiency. I've seen the reports. There was a pause. Then, softer. She asked, "Do you hate me?" The question was quiet, not theatrical. She didn't ask to manipulate. She asked because she genuinely didn't know the answer. "No," I said. "But I stopped organizing my life around your understanding of me, and that took time and a lot of unlearning." She looked away for a second, then back. "I've spent so much of my life being seen. I never realized what it means to be invisible in your own family." That line landed heavier than anything else she had said, and not because it was poetic, because it was finally real. I studied her for a long moment, then said, "You've been the star. That's not your fault, but you learned to see light only when it reflected off of you. That made the rest of us shadows." Vanessa didn't defend herself. She didn't interrupt. She simply nodded once, as if she had finally understood something she couldn't undo, but wanted to stop repeating. "I'm not asking to partner," she said after a moment. "I know what that would look like from the outside. I'm just asking to learn, quietly, if you ever open that door." I took a breath, slow and intentional. Neura isn't a product. It's a framework built on how humans fail to listen to each other. It's not just about logic. It's about attention. If you want to learn, start there. Don't ask me for access. Practice showing up without assumption. That was the closest thing to an invitation I could offer, and it was enough. She stood, didn't reach for a hug, didn't apologize again, just met my eyes and said, "You were right to build it without us. If you hadn't, none of this would exist." Then she turned and left. I sat alone in that room for a moment longer, not because I needed to recover, but because I wanted to remember what it felt like when someone who once interrupted you learns how to leave space instead. That's how you know change might actually stick, not when someone apologizes, but when they leave the room differently than they entered. 2 days later, I received an email from Harvard confirming the keynote. They included the full lineup, a draft of the press release, and a request to schedule a pre-event interview. I scanned the document in silence. My name stood at the top, followed by a short bio that included only 3 words: founder, Neura, architect. Not a daughter, not a sister, not a woman succeeding despite something, just who I was. I let that sit for a moment, then closed the email without replying. Not out of arrogance, just out of clarity. The recognition wasn't the point anymore. The work had already outlived the need for anyone else to explain it for me. That evening, I sat alone in the gallery lounge with the lights dimmed low and the screens looping silent visuals of our empathy engine in motion. It looked like color breathing, streams of red and blue shifting as user feedback passed through our calibration model. We had spent years refining how the system responded to voice tones, hesitation, conflict triggers, and emotional avoidance. It was designed to teach systems how to hear what people meant, not just what they said. It wasn't built to win awards. It was built for nurses during night shift trauma drills, for caseworkers juggling impossible caseloads, for high school teachers trying to diffuse a panic attack without triggering it further. I thought about my father, about how he always spoke of legacy like it was an inheritance, passed down through blood and pedigree. He used the word like a trophy case, something earned by association, preserved by control. But my definition had shifted. Legacy, to me, had become the impact you leave that no one can revoke, the thing that outlives your last conversation, and I knew then that I wasn't waiting for theirs anymore. Rachel walked in quietly and handed me a tablet. "New update from Helsinki," she said. Their team added 3 new privacy flags to the emotion index protocol. They want your sign-off. I reviewed the note, made one edit, and passed it back. Tell them to push to stage 2. It's ready. She hesitated for a second. Also, she added, your mother called. She asked if you'd consider having dinner next week. No agenda, just dinner. I didn't respond right away. Not because I didn't want to, but because I no longer responded automatically to the word mother, like it was a title with unquestionable weight. After a few seconds, I asked, did she say where? Rachel nodded. She offered to come here, said she wanted to see where you work. Said she wanted to understand. That word sat strangely in the air. Understand. It was the word I had longed to hear for years, but hearing it now, in this version of my life, made me feel something different. I didn't feel hopeful. I felt neutral. I had changed too much to need anything from that kind of visit, but I also wasn't angry. I was just tired of watching people arrive too late to a version of me I had already evolved past. Tell her I'm open to it, I said calmly. Next Friday, after hours, she can come by the lab, not the gallery. Rachel smiled slightly, then turned to leave. The door clicked softly behind her, and I sat in the stillness, listening to the quiet hum of the system cooling down for the night. In that silence, something settled inside me. Not peace, not exactly, something sturdier, ownership. A few minutes later, I received a text from Grace. It was short, just 3 words. It's already working. She had attached a screenshot from our Sao Paulo pilot, a teacher standing in front of a classroom, wearing a low-profile headset, smiling mid-sentence. Behind her, a whiteboard filled with real-time student feedback pulled from Nura's Behavior Sync tool. In the bottom corner of the frame, someone had added a note, user stress response dropped by 68% during conflict moment. I stared at it for a while, not because I was surprised, but because it reminded me that our work wasn't a theory. It was a tool, and it was already changing how people related to one another. That, to me, was legacy, not a name carved into stone or chiseled into a wall of family portraits, but a shift in how someone breathes through difficulty, because something you built made their world a little less hostile. I didn't need my parents to validate that. I didn't need Vanessa to join the mission. I had walked through the part of my story where recognition mattered, and I had arrived in the place where action did the talking. As I closed the gallery lights for the night, I looked back once, not to admire the space, but to witness what it had become. It wasn't about proving myself anymore. It was about continuing, without permission, without apology, without waiting for the past to catch up. Friday came quickly. The lab lights were dimmed, the security feed was quiet, and Grace had gone home early after finalizing our new European data compliance strategy. I stayed behind, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to walk through the space one more time before opening it to someone who had never seen it when it mattered. My mother arrived precisely at 7. Punctuality had always been her form of control. She stepped inside slowly, taking in the quiet, sterile architecture of the lab, the minimal furniture, the muted digital interfaces pulsing gently from the walls. She looked older than I remembered from just a week ago, not fragile, just smaller, like someone beginning to realize that presence and power weren't always the same thing. I offered her tea, which she declined, then guided her toward the long table where we hosted most of our internal prototype discussions. She looked around carefully, eyes pausing at the framed patents and the small plaque we received from the Department of Education for Nura's public school integration model. It's quiet in here, she said finally, like a courtroom before a ruling. I nodded. We built it to listen. The noise happens when you leave the room, not when you're in it. She didn't respond right away. She walked along the glass wall that overlooked our operations floor, her heels soft on the concrete, her silence heavier than anything she might have said. After a while, she turned toward me, fingers tracing the edge of a schematic pinned under acrylic. You were always careful with your words, even as a child, she said. But I didn't realize you were being careful with your silence, too. I didn't reply. I waited. She sat across from me and folded her hands like she was giving a lecture. Then, after a long pause, she simply said, I owe you an apology. I let those words exist for what they were. Not a breakthrough, not a fix, just a sentence that cost her more than I'd ever know. I don't expect you to explain this world to me, she continued, but I want you to know I'm willing to ask questions now, not to judge, just to listen. I've spent a lifetime answering questions. I'd like to try learning instead. I studied her face. It was the same one I had grown up looking at, hoping for recognition. But this version was different, less sculpted, more human. I don't need an apology, I said quietly. Not anymore. What I needed was to stop waiting for one. Her eyes softened, but she didn't cry. Neither of us were built that way. Your father was surprised when I told him you agreed to meet, she said. He asked if I thought you'd changed. I told him I wasn't sure. But now I think it wasn't you who changed. I think it was me who never saw what was already there. That, more than anything, landed, because for the first time, I wasn't being interpreted through the lens of failure or defiance. I was simply being acknowledged, not for building a billion-dollar AI company, but for existing in full, without needing to justify it anymore. She stood and walked toward the exit without ceremony. Before she left, she looked back and said, if there's ever something you want us to understand better, you don't have to speak loudly. Just let us know how to listen. Then she was gone, and for once. The door didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like a threshold that no longer required me to walk through it to be understood. I stayed in the lab for a while longer, watching the real-time model testing across our pilot partners, hospitals in Montreal, high schools in Minneapolis, human rights organizations in Kenya. The same platform I once hid because I thought no one would believe in it had now outgrown every boardroom that once dismissed it, not because I forced it to, but because I built it to last beyond the need for permission. Legacy isn't what they give you after you prove your worth. Legacy is what you create when you stop asking to be invited to the table and start designing the room yourself. I didn't rewrite my story to prove anyone wrong. I rewrote it because I had waited too long for someone else to hold the pen. And once I held it, I never let go. What would happen if we stopped waiting for recognition and just started building in silence? Knowing we already belong,